Hey, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first of our series of three webinars on impact measurement that we're hosting. I'm Karim Harji, the Program Director of the Oxford Impact Measurement Program, joined by Alex Nicholls, who's the Academic Director of the program. We're really thrilled to see so much interest in the topic, and we've got some interesting innovations and tensions that we're going to highlight for you today. We also had a lot of your questions that came in before the webinar, and so we've got some time at second half of the presentation to work through those. And we look forward to seeing more of your questions in the chat box as well, so please send those to us. I also wanted to note that because we've received so much interest in this topic, we're going to be hosting another webinar after this that will cover just your questions. And so we'll try and get through a few this time around and then cover the next webinar, which will be in a month on March 10th. So we'll talk about those details later on. So just by way of quick introductions, I'm Karim, be leading this with Alex, who's the academic director for all three of our programs, as well as a professor of social entrepreneurship at the Said Business School. We co-lead this impact measurement program now in its third year, and we'll hear from also some of our alumni who have been asking questions through the chat box as well. But just wanted to then hand it over to Alex to provide a bit of a background on our programs, very quickly to talk about the impact measurement program. Then we'll get into some of the content around our innovations and tensions, and both Alex and I will present a couple of those, and then we will look to pick up on some of the questions that you've posed for us. Maybe Alex, over to you to give us a quick overview of the program.
Thank you, Karim, and good morning, afternoon, or evening to you all, wherever you are in the world. It's a pleasure to speak with you. I'm Alex Nicholls. So as you can see, as a little overview of our approach to this program, I mean, our view is that these issues of impact are absolutely central to so many questions in investing, management decision-making, strategic planning. And our main focus is, of course, in these issues of social impact, but actually these issues are germane, actually, I think, across so many areas of life now in both the commercial, public sector, and also non-profit areas. So we see this as a really important program out of the three, and one that is complementary to the other two as well. So this, as many of you will know, of course, is a messy area. It's a new area. It's an area that's being institutionalized in front of us as we look at it. And so we really want to get together with experts in the room, you guys, and of course our speakers, to tease out some of the key issues that are really at the cutting edge of this area right now. So to give you greater clarity about what the frameworks and approaches are, but also, as you see in the second part of this slide, to have plenty of critical inquiry, discussion. We want to be honest about the limitations and problems that are in this emerging space, but also give you, through our applied learning with experienced practitioners in the room and each other, of course, the chance to make sense of some of these conundrums and some of these challenges in the space. And I think the good news is we've come an awful long way in this space. So many of you will know this, but we've come from a really messy space into a space that's beginning to shake out into some kind of shape, but there's still many big questions to be asked and some answers to be given. So our attempt is to give you a roadmap through this complex area with some good practical stuff, but also lots of good questions to ask. Next slide. So one of the main organizing principles for our program, and many of these things we show you today will go through in much more detail in subsequent webinars, but also in the actual program itself if you can join us. But we'll cover things in a superficial way today because of the time. But this is a key framework we use throughout the program. And some of you will be familiar with the kind of theory of change model that goes from inputs, processes, outputs, and outcomes. So this is not quite the same. It's sort of linear, but it's linear as a conceptual model rather than the kind of process model. And really the real takeaway from this slide is the first box at the top on the left, which is we begin with this key question when we explore impact measurement and management, which is why. And the tendency often in practice, and this is quite understandable because of the pressures of time and so on, is we jump straight to the kind of what's the unit of analysis? What do we measure? How do we measure it? What's the metric? How do we get hold of this stuff in some way that's usable and interesting? And those things are really important, but we encourage you in the program to begin with taking a step back and asking questions about why, because we will argue in the program that having better answers to, why are we producing this data? For whom? Who cares about it? What's the purpose of it? Will then allow you much better to answer the questions about what, how, and then how to use the information going forward. So part of this critical framing of the program we mentioned before is to begin with some of these questions. Now, don't be terrified. That's not to say we're going to spend the whole week gazing at our navels going, oh, why do we do this? And what's the point? But this is to say we need to ask some critical questions up front. And so then we can set off on the journey of building impact measurement and management systems. So we go through these framings below and onwards along there to the managing for impact piece at the end. And we hope this kind of journey will make sense for you as a heuristic model to then take back to your individual organizations.
Great, thanks, Alex.
Thank you.
And as Alex mentioned, this follows the flow of our week, but we also think it is a helpful schematic, regardless of where you are in your journey. A lot of organizations and people go right to the how. And as we'll talk about a little bit later, there are a lot of interesting innovations around how we measure, but a lot of tensions when we think about the reconciliation across this spectrum that links the why and the how. So just to now get into the content, I'll begin with just a couple of examples and maybe some themes on innovation. And the first one, as you'll see here, is just talking about how we see impact measurement popping up in daily life. Got two visuals here. This may be quite familiar to many of you, on the webinar. The first is the idea of how we are now using our phones in particular to track how we think about our health, and in particular things like steps, sleep analysis. You can see there's also meditation, heart rate, etc. This is really fascinating because for those of you that use these in your daily life, you know that it influences a lot of your daily behaviors. You can set things like targets if you want to get your 10,000 steps in, like I try and do. If you want to try and monitor your sleep patterns or think about how your week evolves, these are quite helpful because they provide a basic level of monitoring that's actually quite seamless. It helps you understand your patterns, any spikes, for example, along the week, how consistent you are, and the kind of contribution to your outcomes. So a lot of this is, in a sense, activity and output level data that is providing you with a sense of where you're trending towards. Obviously, there are a lot of other variables that get in the way, but it is just one example of where we're seeing technology pop up and use impact measurement data in some way. In this case, obviously, around your personal health. The other one on the right-hand side, which you may have seen in airports and public places, etc., a very quick and easy emoji-based surveying. Again, it's a really interesting example of how we're moving from the classic filling out a survey to thinking about how you can look at instant feedback loops as an example here. And so in this case, trying to make it fairly quick and easy to get feedback from people. But on the other hand, also want to try and understand, well, why do people vote in certain patterns and what do you do about those things? So when you think about that schematic we showed earlier, moving from the why to the how is also quite important to ask when you look at these kinds of things. Do people react, for example, to certain kinds of data when they see them? Those of you that, again, use your iPhones in certain ways, you know that if you're not hitting your targets, perhaps you'll do that extra, 15-minute walk, etc. So this is just one kind of example of how we're seeing impact measurement pop up in daily life. And I just want to extend that a little bit to talk about an application, particularly in the fashion and retail apparel industry. Now, we know that a lot of brands, this is just one data point from the Fashion Revolution website, don't really have visibility into their suppliers. And many of us now think that We're adjusting our behaviors to respond to social and environmental concerns. We're shopping differently, we're eating differently, we're hopefully investing differently as well. And so if one of the challenges that we've acknowledged is that suppliers or brands don't have access to a lot of their suppliers, well, there's a market opportunity there, but there's also an impact measurement opportunity there. What if you had the opportunity to look at any item of clothing, and for that matter, any of your purchases, and trace down and understand how it all evolved through the supply chain? This is an example from a company called Provenance. You can find more information at provenance.org, where they have worked with a series of different products, including with some fashion designers, to be able to provide insight into every part of the product and value chain and supply chain. They're trying to understand how inputs get converted into the final product. You can see the extension of that when we think about the social and environmental data that can come out of this, which would include things like working conditions, how workers get paid, the kind of water usage, electricity usage, energy usage along the entire chain. And that, I think, could be quite transformative when we think about how social and environmental metrics pop up in our daily life. Just two very quick examples when you begin to also think about the implications for how we might ask questions around impact measurement in daily life. We'd want to know about, are the materials that come from the places we think that they are supposed to come from, are they authentic? Is there some contamination? There are now actual technologies that exist to be able to test that. How do we know that workers are being fairly treated and represented within these supply chains? Again, there are new technologies that are being able to demonstrate that. I think what the broader point is that we're beginning to see that social and environmental data is popping up in some very tangible ways to be able to triangulate for us what is really happening on the ground, provide some degree of verification, and help us inform our decisions in practice. We're beginning to see some of these occur in a different range of sectors, but just wanted to highlight some examples from work that myself and some colleagues at the Working Capital Fund have been using. The second example, so building on impact measurement showing up in different places in daily life, the second set of innovations is around using technology to not only prove impact, but also to improve and learn, and not only to be more efficient, for example, around how we are collecting data, but to begin to think about the full cycle of ways in which technology can be applied to help us make better decisions when we think about impact measurement. This is just a visual for those of you that are interested from Merle Tech. The link is at the bottom there, of the number of ways in which we can use technology to both prove, improve, as well as to learn beyond just simplifying our data collection. And I want to go a little bit deeper by extending some of this into lean data. Many of you might be familiar with this, and for those of you that are not, lean data has come out of Acumen, and now incubated initially there, and now in a spinoff called 60 Decibels. They're one of our speakers over the last few years. What's been interesting there is to try and think about how you can get data directly from the user or beneficiary, and to think about what impact means for them. And as we'll see in the next few slides, I think the innovation there is how we combine the best of quantitative and qualitative data in a relatively seamless way, not only think about what is happening, but also the context within which we're interpreting that data. Here are a couple of examples from actual questions that were published in a guide that 60 Decibels and others were published last year. You can ask questions, for example, around when people bought a product or service, what was the intended impact they were looking for? Interestingly, if you make this an open-ended one, you might find that there are a range of responses that you may not have anticipated. It's equally important to then ask, how important are those changes to people? There again, you can make it either open-ended or close-ended. But what's powerful, I think, is this combination of responses helps you understand the context within which people make decisions. So it's not enough to just ask one of those questions. We really have to interpret data in the context of how these questions are being asked together. Taking that even further, you want to be able to understand what else contributed to those changes. So you can ask, again, a combination of either open-ended or closed-ended questions. Just highlighted a couple here in terms of asking people in an open-ended way. Is there anything else that they think might be influential? You can obviously supplement that with research data and your awareness of the context. You might try and understand, are there any other alternatives to the product or service in the market? And I think importantly, when we think about the relationship between collecting data, using that data, and then thinking about accountability, this type of question is very interesting around whether we expect the organization to use feedback from the survey to improve its work. And that gives you a sense of not only whether we're using technology in a one-way manner to be able to collect data, but whether we can try and actually have a two-way feedback loop. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, in fact, as one of the tensions, because right now we're very good on the innovation side at using technology to collect lots of data from lots of people in a fairly efficient way. We can do really great analysis and disaggregate the findings by different groups. But where maybe perhaps we have a bit of a gap is how to think about the accountability question back to those groups. So finally, to round out some of the pieces around the innovation side, we're beginning to see this combination of metrics and narratives come together through tools and approaches like this, where we can really bring some context to the work. We can begin to triangulate it. And then we can begin to ask questions of how do we disaggregate this data? And so I think technology is providing a range of different ways for us to both ask the right questions, provide a level of granularity of analysis, and begin to track over time. As we'll talk about a little bit later, one of the tensions here is how do we close that feedback loop? Are we just using technologies, for example, to have a one-way flow of information, or do we truly engage in a dialogue? So I think that this is one of the tensions that we have now in the space. And how do we demonstrate back to our users and stakeholders that we are in fact adjusting and shifting our responses to course correct in ways that respond to what they tell us around the intended impact and whether or not that it's occurring. One tension, and just to round this section out before I hand it over to Alex, many of you would be familiar with randomized control trials, and they've become even more visible more recently with the Nobel Prize winners in economics who've been recognized for some of this work and its applications to development, international development, etc. There's a lot to say on this, but I think one of the tensions, interestingly, is on one hand, this has promoted a very technical approach to impact measurement and particularly impact evaluation. These are often described as the gold standard. But I would say my interpretation of this tension is that in this drive towards robust and precise answers, RCTs can be a fairly good tool if you have a fairly narrow question, very narrow design, and some structured conditions. We've seen that in real life, these conditions are hard to create in practice. And as we try and get more precise, as we try and avoid biases, it's very hard to think about the generalizability of some of these findings because the context is so different in other places, let alone some of the ethical issues of these approaches. So I think a big tension for me, and we can talk more about this in our Q&A, is that these designs are set up to do some very specific things and have in some cases very limited generalizability, and they've been sold perhaps to do more than they actually are designed to do. And so if you think about replication as being a goal for why we do good impact measurement, to be able to understand what works in other places, perhaps this is not the best approach. And for me, this is popping up as a tension in many places where on one hand, there seem to be gold standard, a precise way of getting precise answers. On the other hand, they actually have very limited value when we think about how we can extrapolate out to other contexts. So I look forward to hearing from some of you around whether you agree with that or not. I hand it over to Alex for his innovations and tensions now.
Thank you, Karim. Well, let's begin with impact bonds. Now, some of you will be very familiar with this, and it's the impact bond landscape is growing, but it's become one of the most sort of sexy and exciting topics in this kind of overlap between impact investing, public sector spending, and impact measurement. And the impact bond begins in Britain in 2010 as a social impact bond. Subsequently, we have had development impact bonds. We now have environmental impact bonds moving forward, and who knows, we'll find other kind of categories of impact bonds too. So it's a big innovation. Why does it matter to us? Well, because it seems to offer the opportunity to monetize impact in some form, which is one of the kind of holy grails of this space, and we'll come in a minute to some pitfalls and opportunities in that particular category. But first of all, let's think about bonds and impact bonds. Well, of course, we begin by saying it's not a bond. So there's an interesting apocryphal story about why they're called social impact bonds, which you'll have to come and pay to be on our course for me to tell you, but they're not actually bonds. At some point, there was a thought to call them contingent futures liability structures, but that doesn't sound so great as an impact bond, does it? So that kind of got kicked out. But it's not any kind of debt product, so it's not a bond in a conventional financial sense. What it actually is a social investment contract, typically between three key players. Somebody who's prepared to pay for measurable outcomes, often that has been the government or potentially a DFI or a foundation, so somebody who cares about outcomes. Somebody who's provided to fund the work towards those outcomes and expect a repayment back if they are achieved from the outcomes payer. So that's typically a private investor, an impact investor often, it doesn't have to be. Could be Goldman Sachs, could be JP Morgan or others. And then a third player will be the service providers, the people actually are creating the outcome. And so what tends to happen is a third-party provider of consultancy services like Social Finance UK or Instiglia or Numbers for Good or others organize the building of a contract. And the contract begins with a measurable outcome that someone's prepared to pay for. And then you look for investment, and then you look for a service provider or providers to be brought in to deliver those outcomes. And you structure the contract typically so that you have an agreed set of outcomes which can be measured, and then you have a payment schedule that's connected to those outcomes being achieved, where the greater the outcome, the greater the return to the private investor and the greater the payment from the outcome payer, often capped at some level that's considered reasonable by all parties. So these take quite a long time to put together, although the amount of time is getting much less as we have more examples. But I suppose the really important point is that in principle, and I'll come to some critiques in a moment, the impact bonds do seem to offer this holy grail of a way of putting a financial value on a measurable social or environmental outcome, which allows us then to, potentially to do all kinds of other financial modeling and so forth. And the final point here is there's often a third-party verifier of the outcomes, because of course the outcome level of achievement is the key issue for triggering payment. So all parties in the contract have to be happy that that's being done properly and that the numbers are accurate, if you like. So what's happened is this has proliferated around the world. So this is, as near to up to date as I could get. This is from Social Finance UK's SIB database, which is a publicly available resource. You can find it from their website. And what they try to do on this website is update around the world where these bonds are being put into place. So these are those that are active, not those that are under development. That would be another, however many, possibly twice as many now are under development. So around about 140 bonds. You can see the capital raised so far is fairly small. So we have to be realistic about what bonds are actually achieving. The numbers are fairly small. Effectively, many of them are pilots and test examples, but their effect on lives touched is not trivial. If you go on this website and click on these various little blobs in your country or regional area, you'll find detailed information of the number of bonds that are going on there and some detail about what the contracts are, the areas they're working in. Sometimes you find information about the outcomes measures and so on. So it's a really useful resource just to get a global view of this stuff. I think also if you click, Karim, also on their website, you can see the breakdown of sectors in which the currently live bonds are operating, and you can see there's a big focus on employment and workforce development. That's the large kind of turquoisey coloured ring, part of the ring, 44, homelessness and housing, and you can read down the list. And the kind of environmental impact bonds are obviously very new. That's why there's just 3 of those up and running now. Now, we have some assumptions around this emerging space, and here they are. So the question is, are any of these true or not so far as we can tell? Now, you have to say a caveat is that many of these bonds are not concluded yet, so we don't know full results, and this is going to be a piece of work going forward in terms of analysis, and particularly our friends at the Go Lab at the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford. The Go Lab there are doing a lot of this analysis, so that's another website you can go to, the Go Lab they're called, if you want to find that information. So let's go through these in turn. So is there some evidence of these so far? Do they improve social outcomes? Well, yes, they do. And if you click, we'll have a smiley face, Karim, I think. So they do. And that's almost inevitable if you think about it, because their precondition is that they achieve an outcome. Otherwise, there's no payment back to the investor. So it's almost unsurprising that many of them do improve outcomes because of the structure of their contracts. It's also worth saying that many operate in areas where there is no provision of services or very poor provision already. So again, it's perhaps not surprising that they do improve social outcomes by their own measures, and we can talk about that in Q&A about whether that's appropriate or not. Saving public money, unhappy face. There's practically no evidence this is the case, and yet it's one of the key assumptions people make about these bonds, particularly if you are a payment outcomes payer, let's say in a government department. The kind of way you sell these is to say, oh, we save money if you actually achieve superior outcomes. Actually, there's very little hard data that's happening, but there's ways in which you might think they're still beneficial to government departments. For example, greater efficiency of government spending. So having more social outcomes for the same amount of money is equally valuable, I think, than just saving money. But that's at the very least an open question. Probably no evidence so far. Do they make money for investors? Yeah, they do. There's plenty of evidence these bonds finish and the investors get their money back plus a nice return. In Bridges Fund Management, which had a first social impact bond they launched, I think it was about £8 or £10 million in that fund. When it closed, I think they paid about 8% gross to investors, which is not a massive return if it's risk adjusted, and once they subtracted fees, it's maybe not so great, but it's a return, and others are doing even better than that. So yes, investors are making some money, and that's growing the market. Increased methodological rigor. Well, this is not clear yet. So this comes back to Karim's point about RCTs. You could argue that if impact bonds really can monetize outcomes effectively, well, then they probably will be better at quantifying or measuring outcomes in order to be able to do that. And it's a persuasive argument, but I think we're not sure if that's true anymore, or indeed what the evidence for that might be. But it maybe will. So I wouldn't say that's proven, but it's not entirely implausible. And could they create standards? Well, again, I don't think so. So the idea that the impact bond market will set a standard price for, let's say, a young girl's education, well, we're a long way away from that anyway. Perhaps that might happen, but there's no evidence so far. So there's a mixed set of results here about these key assumptions, but nevertheless, they grow like Topsy still. So people like them. Okay, next. So here are some more particular critiques. I won't spend time on all of these in too much detail, but you can read them. Certainly there's a critique that these models undermine the role of the state, so they could be seen as being alternatives to public provision of things like education or health, and that could be seen as a problem. Why do we not expect our governments across the world to provide basic services? And of course, to some degree, they privatize those social outcomes because they monetize an outcome like a girl's education or access to clean water and create a profit for somebody. So in that respect, do they profiteer on the backs of the most vulnerable? And for example, with development impact bonds, which take foreign capital invested in a developing country and then return an investor to a foreign investor, be a sort of new colonialism. It's just a way of extracting value out of a poor country. Is risk and return allocated fairly across 3 parties? That's something that's an empirical question that we've yet to crack in terms of evidence, but it's an important one. What happens when they finish? What are the exit models for a service provider to a SIB? That's still an area that needs to be properly thought through. And are they the solution to the world's problems? Well, some people will say they are. not evidence they are yet, primarily because of that small amount of capital involved in the current models, less than $500 million. But I mean, we'll see what happens. Certainly they're very popular at the moment as a model. Okay, moving on. So the second opportunity and tension is around numbers more generally, and this flows out of, I think, our SIB discussion, where the measurable outcome with a financial value is such an attractive opportunity for investors and impact measurement people. Well, why is this whole kind of monetization numbers stuff so interesting? Well, it's kind of because we're brought up in a kind of rationalist world to think numbers are seductive, numbers matter, numbers are somehow more real than non-numbers, and this is just a function of the way we've organized our knowledge in societies over the last couple of hundred years. And it's not to say it's wrong, right? I mean, the advances in technology and so forth have been driven by our ability to map and model stuff in clever equations and so on, and land on the moon and whatever. But there is a kind of dominance of the numbers, kind of argument in the world, and that also can play out in the way we think about our impact measurement. We always want a number. Numbers are somehow more real than other things. And then the next slide says, well, not only are numbers seductive, you can click over, Karim. Maybe you can. Can you click over to the next slide? Maybe not. Well, if you could, the next slide would say that not only are numbers seductive, but so is monetizing numbers, which suggests that part of the driver why SIBs are so powerful is simply that they've allowed outcomes to be monetized in a way which is very attractive, primarily because it's a single measure. So money really allows us to put a consistent measure, a dollar, a yen, a pound, on an outcome. So taken together, these two questions are, firstly, can we put a calculable number on an impact? And secondly, as you can see in this picture, can we put a financial value on it? These are two very big issues in this space now, and they're very attractive to people. And so there's plenty of effort and intellectual sort of heft and investment going into these issues of finding units of analysis which can be numerically calculated and then finding a financial value for them, because it seems very attractive to investors and others, and public sector people too. So carry on. But why monetize? Well, it seems as if it allows us to compare, apples and apples, apples and pears, because if we can take multiple different outcomes, put a number on them, put a price on that number, then suddenly we can have a market. We can say, well, we can see what's worth more, what's worth less. We can see what gives us a lesser or greater return on our investment and capital, and we can play with these social environmental factors as if they were any other financial market factor. But as you'll see, sorry, just from the cartoon below, if you can take a moment to read it, essentially what this is saying is numbers really don't tell us stories. Numbers, even if they're the numbers which are genuinely indicative of what's happening in the world, if we think of an outcome, really don't tell us why or what effects that is having on given populations or the environment. So the point about qualitative data, which takes into account stories, personal accounts, case studies, the voice of individuals, it really is dangerous, I think, to suggest that has no value in the way we think of impact. In fact, probably quite the reverse. The monetization and numbers questions are only part of the picture, I think. Okay, so why monetize? We've said, well, because a single measure is comparable, it lets us catch externalities, maybe it may fit into accounting mechanism we already have, but some of these critiques and pitfalls are really important too, because the danger of monetization, as I've mentioned, is it gives us a kind of patina of precision. It makes us think we've got accuracy because it's been given a number, because we're excited by numbers and we think they represent reality. And the danger is that really loses all the important noise around priorities, perspectives, voice, power. and so on and so forth. So the danger is that monetizing and putting a numerical value on outcomes may even reduce the overall impact of a project by dismissing lots of other really important data. So, so this is a central discussion we'll have in the program, really about monetization and putting numbers on outcomes and impact, and what does that mean for us as people who care about impact. I think we move to Karim maybe now for a couple of possible futures.
Great, thanks, Alex. So we thought it'd be kind of fun as we wrap up this part of the content, and before we get into your questions, just sketch out a bunch of possibilities when we think about, what could impact measurement look like in the future, or at least what are some of the implications for some of what we've just discussed in terms of things that we think about interesting, perhaps could be classified as innovations, but also where there are some very real tensions, and how perhaps those might be resolved in the future. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is from awareness to ... and that's really to bring the point that we now have a lot more information, and we will continue to have more information around some types of social and environmental metrics. There's no shortage of frameworks and tools that are beginning to tell us a little bit about what is happening. But if we extend the example that I described earlier around all of our clothing, and the fact that technologies do exist right now to be able to trace, to source, to be able to understand things around working conditions, worker pay, source materials, energy usage, etc. The fact that we will have more data at our fingertips, the fact that it might be easier and it might be verifiable, this still doesn't tell us whether we would change our purchasing behaviors in response to that information. So one of the things that we talk about in the program is, again, moving from the why to the what to the how to the so what. And how do you make decisions on the basis of different kinds of impact data? How much data is enough? How precise do you have to be? And so one of the questions that we'll maybe lead with here, and we pick up on our program as well, is assuming you had this information, what would you do differently? Fashion Transparency Report has, for example, on the right-hand side here, a number of different aspects that they point to that you could take in terms of concrete and immediate actions. But what if, for example, you disagree with some of the data that you're getting? What if, for example, you see that workers are getting paid minimum wage, but what if you think that a more appropriate metric, for example, would be that they get over half of the value of your purchase price is going directly to workers because that's where the bulk of the work is happening? Would you do anything about that? Would you insist on changing your purchasing behaviors, etc.? So I guess the point here is that one possible future is that we have a lot of information, but that we don't do anything about that. Another possible future is that we use that information and anticipate the behavioral aspects of making this information more available in order to reduce the gap between intentions and actions that we tend to see still around sustainability. So that's one set of pathways. Another is around impact washing. So many of you will have heard variations of this term: greenwashing, increasingly SDG washing. See the little graphic there at the bottom. If you Google impact washing, there's actually a soap that you can buy that's called impact washing, which I thought would just be a funny anecdote. But we are beginning to see this pop up in the context of climate. You see the report on the left-hand side. And then many large corporates are coming under some scrutiny right now for SDG washing. It's perhaps not surprising when we think about some of the ways in which we talk about measurement, still very high level, still very undefined. So one possible future is that we see the dilution and perhaps the challenges of being able to provide legitimacy around impact measurement, particularly if there's only going to be voluntary disclosure and self-reporting. On the other hand, there might be some possible futures where we see more regulations, more pressure from customers, more comparability across different kinds of organizations, and more transparency to begin to think about accountability, not just reporting and disclosure. And then it gets very interesting when we think about the innovations that promote accountability, not that are just promoting more transparency. And here again, it could go one of several ways. We've had some experiences in the past from other sectors where we can see the pros and cons of more regulation. It's not always the answer, but it can help. On the other hand, we've already seen a lot of evidence that customers are demanding this information, governments are demanding this information, companies are increasingly using social and environmental data to make better decisions around how they think about their supply chains, their product designs, and employee retention. So perhaps one possible positive version of this future is that we actually use this information to reduce impact washing, because certainly we're beginning to see more instances of that as it relates to the SDGs and to any green labeling at the moment. So those are just two reflections and perhaps some provocations. Alex, over to you.
Thanks, Karim. Yeah, and again, just a couple of things to raise. Sorry to give you a slide of one of my papers, but it's just indicative of this topic of materiality. There's many other interesting things we can look at. Just two things I'm going to talk about before we take Q&A about also possible futures. I mean, we've spoken already about some of the issues around materiality in different ways thus far, but I think this just is one way of focusing on it particularly. Now, materiality, as those of you who are accountants or work in financial accounting will know, is a well-established concept in reporting and accounting of finance, and essentially it's as you know, a judgment about what is and isn't relevant to be included in accounts, financial accounts, in order for investors or the owners of the capital to make a sensible decision about the performance of an organization. So we already have this kind, and it's an audited process. We already have this well-established idea. So the interesting thing for us in this space is, what does materiality mean when we think about impact and impact accounting and reporting? And so I think this is a really cutting-edge set of questions here about can we learn from standard accounting principles to think about what is material here? And this paper that's just up here in front of you is one where I tried to wrestle with that, which essentially was to highlight the sets of uncertainties that we have in impact measurement compared with financial accounting at the moment, because of these various metrics, no standard unit of analysis. We have a lot of uncertainty here. So one of the arguments I make in this paper, and I think is something we'll discuss in the program, is one way around uncertainty is to pick up on what Karim was saying earlier about things like lean data, to say, well, one way we can get around uncertainty is to make sure we really listen to the people that are allegedly experiencing outcomes and take their evidence as being one way of overcoming some of our uncertainty about performance. And in that sense, the materiality construct, which in accounting for finance is to do with a judgment of the firm's accountant, and that being verified by the judgment of an auditor. So judgment is key. That judgment becomes different in this space and becomes a question of judging the validity of the accounting for impact data we have, which partly I think can be evidenced by listening to the people with whom we work to try to achieve outcomes. So that's really what the paper is about. But the bigger question here is, what's the role of judgment in making decisions around what is and isn't valid impact evidence, and then how do we interpret that? So that's really the materiality piece here, which I think is a real question going forward, and it also spins off into questions of risk as well. And then the other thing, as a sort of possible future, and again, we're choosing these things as just flavors of the program. These are not necessarily the only issues at all that we cover. Again, is something, forgive me for having a picture of my own name again on the slide, but it's something I've worked in for 20 years, and which is fair trade. But I think that's not to say fair trade dominates the program. It's just an interesting way of understanding how the points Karim made earlier about traceability and provenance have been institutionalized for 20 years in both a process of audit and a certification system and label, which demonstrates the audited effects of the fair trade model. And those of you who don't know it, it's essentially a model that's based on a guaranteed payment at the front end of a supply chain to farmers or producers, which is designed to be at least livable, if not above livable, and which protects them from fluctuations in pricing in the market and so on, guarantees them a living, and several other features go behind it. And then you have a process of audit, and then you have a label which customers can choose to buy or not to buy. And many caveats about fair trade. As I say, I've worked around the space for 20 years, so I know lots of the pitfalls, and it's not a perfect model, but it's one of the more established, along with the organic label, mechanisms we have to connect customers to impact in a relatively convincing way. And the nice thing about it is it uses the market. So people who complain about, for example, paying more to a poor farmer as being a distortion of the market, because if the coffee price is a price that's going to make him starve, well, that's tough because that's the world coffee price. The interesting thing here is this is a model driven by consumers choosing to buy these products against others. So that to me is a perfect market model, and I don't think we should argue otherwise. But there are many other things we pick up on this traceability question. This is just one example that I know well. So I think now we're moving to Q&A. Should I kick off? We got a number of questions sent in advance, so thank you to those of you who did that. If you're on the webinar right now, I think Karim and I said maybe we might just touch on a couple of those before we take some general questions. Is that right, Karim? Should I do that?
Yeah, let's go for that.
Okay, so we got, as I say, many questions, and apologies for the many of you who wrote in that we won't touch on them right now. But a couple of ones I might just quickly talk to. There was a very interesting question about what I would call perverse incentives, which really we've covered this already a little bit. Namely, once we monetize impacts and we go for numbers, doesn't that create perverse incentives just to follow the numbers and to only report to numbers? And I think it's a really good question, because I think it's absolutely true it could do that. In other words, once you set a benchmark performance that's easily measurable, then there's no real incentive to overperform it or to do other things in your impact process. So I think it's a really good question that makes us think about, again, the trade-offs between having, if we like, robust systems of measurement, which might well have numbers embedded in them, and funding associated with them, perhaps, with the opportunity to game the system, frankly, to choose to only prioritize outcomes which will follow the numbers, and for example, to ignore difficult problems you might want to solve. So this is the classic kind of skimming issue that people talk about, where you might only choose to help the easy to help because they're the ones with whom you get the biggest immediate outcome that you can report back on. So I think that was a very, very interesting question. There was one other question which I'll talk to, and then I'll turn to Karim, about risk and risk and return in this space. And this is something we'll talk about a bit in the program, and something I've tried to think about quite a bit, because it's really important. If we think about in finance, again, if we use that as a model, well understanding whether or not this is true, but well understanding risk and return as being key factors in determining financial outcomes and discounting future cash flows. And we might think this is much less well understood in impact, but probably should be. So I think I don't have an answer for how we should do this, because I think we're working through it right now. But when we do, project future impact outcomes, there's no reason why we shouldn't think of a discount rate, for example, like we do in finance. What would that R rate be? Well, that's a big question. But the issue of assessing risk is important. Now, people like the IMP, the Impact Management Project, some of you will know, have categories of risk, like additionality risk, or the risk of the robustness of the data. There's several categories that are out there, but they're very general. They're not going to help you put a number on this. So this is a really important and emerging field, I think. What's a risk factor in this area? And we'll discuss that in the program, though we don't necessarily have all the answers yet.
Great, thanks, Alex. Let me pick up on a couple of other questions that have come in, and then we'll probably have time for another round. So we've got a couple of questions here, specifically related to impact investing and impact measurement. A couple of questions here, particularly around how to make investors more comfortable with different kinds of metrics and processes. How do we ensure that impact considerations are baked in to the full cycle, both in the pre-investment as well as post-investment? And I would just say, again, we spend quite a bit of time in the program kind of working through that in a hands-on manner through both our main sessions as well as workshop sessions. There are now a number of tools and guides that have been published and will be published this year that walk through the full investment cycle to try and think about how you move, for example, of looking at building a theory of change that incorporates some of these considerations through to your due diligence process, through to post transaction support and monitoring, and thinking about portfolio level impact measurement. I'll just highlight a couple of examples. One would be the working capital fund that I had mentioned earlier. Those of you that are interested, if you go on their website, there are a couple of blogs that talk about that process in terms of the overall approach and then the specific impact criteria and how they are scored. So that's looking at pre-deal and how to convert your theory of change into specific criteria that you could use in your due diligence process. A group called Pacific Community Ventures has published a couple of guides on impact due diligence, both a step-by-step guide as well as looking at best practices in impact due diligence that do touch on other aspects that we've mentioned earlier around SDGs, around impact management project, etc. So those are be just two starting points, and Ashley will pick up on both of these questions in our next webinar in more detail and perhaps go through in a bit of a step-by-step. Francis actually had submitted a couple of interesting tensions in innovation, so just wanted to flag those. One of the questions or comments was perhaps using feedback on the quality or use of services that might be perhaps more useful than measuring the long-term impact of the services. And I guess I would reframe that to say it's not an either or, and it would be both. Similar to what I talked about in terms of lean data earlier, what is really exciting is that we have now the ability to very quickly get specific points of data, identify patterns, trends, and perhaps some negative impacts also in relatively short feedback loops, be able to act on that information much more quickly than we ever have, but at the same time increase the robustness and be able to triangulate different types of data through the use of technology and through the use of, I think, being able to just get closer to where the effects are being felt or being anticipated. It also means that we have to be quite cognizant around how we are collecting and using that data and being quite responsible about it. And so it raises a whole set of other tensions, perhaps around what are the ethics and implications for being responsible around how we collect data, particularly from vulnerable populations. Another point that was raised in the same theme was around segmentation. And again, maybe we'll pick up on this in the next webinar. The importance of segmentation to try and go deeper within specific groups of people, within specific groups of outcomes even, to try and think about asking the why questions. Why are some outcomes different than in other outcomes? How do we think about the relationship between positive and negative outcomes? How much of that could we have anticipated? Do some groups benefit more than others? Again, not only can we use technology to get an insight into these more quickly, but we're beginning to do that, I think, in much more timely manner than we've been able to previously. See, we're almost at time. Alex, do you want to pick up on anything quickly before we hand it over to Annabelle to wrap this up?
Well, no, other than to say, I mean, from our point of view, this is an amazing program. Not to kind of oversell it to you, but we really enjoy working with the people who come along. We're both passionate about this subject. We think this is crucial to trying to improve our world around us. So, if any of you come to join us, we'll have a wonderful time. I would say it's a great program, and we enjoy it. And we get a lot out of it. So, so I hope the energy is there.
Thanks, Alex. And Annabelle, I'll let you jump in now. And I would just say that we've got a lot more questions than we actually can't get to today. But we've now set up the webinar on March 11th, where we will have our core faculty that will be joining. So we'll have at least 3 additional speakers to Alex and I, some of the folks who will help us along with the program throughout the week, and to begin to think about response to some of the questions, from the role of philanthropy, public sector, corporates, etc. So maybe I'll hand it over to Annabelle now to give us some of the details and in terms of what our next steps are to wrap this up.
Okay, thank you, Karim, and thank you everyone who took the time out, firstly to join us today, but secondly also to submit your questions. We were discussing beforehand, I don't think we'd ever seen such a huge response of people who wanted to contribute with their thoughts and questions today, so thank you very much. If we haven't got to your question today, we are looking to run, as Karim said, another webinar next month where we'll address more of these questions moving forward. So the impact measurement program will be taking place on the 29th of June. Currently, we have actually opened applications for our scholarship places. So if you're working currently for an NGO, a non-profit, please get in touch, because we are able to offer a small number of 50% scholarships for those in non-profit organisations. The deadline to apply is the end of this month, so my email's up on the screen. Please email me if you'd like any more information about that, or please feel free to pass on my details to anyone in your network that might also have an interest either in the scholarship or in the measurement program in general. In addition to the impact measurement program, we also have impact investing, which is taking place this March, and social finance, which is taking place in November. We do run monthly webinars spanning across all three programs. So if you're interested in any further information on the general portfolio, again, please get in touch. Thank you once again, and we'll look forward to seeing you all again on our next webinar. We will upload the recording to YouTube and send that link out to you, and we'll also send you the direct link for just the specific webinars along with the playlist of our historic ones. Karim, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, just that when we send you the information for the next webinar, we'd invite your questions again, and really the next webinar is going to be all about your questions. We've got a handful of starting points and we'd love to see more. So please send us any things that are top of mind for you, and we will follow up with some specific details, tools, resources when we present the next one. And thank you all for your participation. We really appreciate it. It's really great to see the level of interest in the topic, and we look forward to having our next discussion with you in a month.